Hey, it's Chris. Now that I've had a little time to catch up from the iPad event, I wanted to share some of the missed details that I know are going to be interesting to people, but they maybe slip through the cracks. So hopefully there's some information here that you're not familiar with yet. The new iPad Pro actually has some attention awareness features, meaning now that the camera is moved, it actually knows when you're looking at the screen or not. As long as you're not watching a movie or using a certain app where you might be expected to look away, if it detects that you're looking away, then the screen will actually get a bit dimmer and it will return, it'll amp back up the brightness when it senses that you're looking back. But that's actually something you can turn off if you want to in settings. If you go to settings, accessibility, face ID, and attention. Now, something else that I noticed that's maybe just a bit of an oddity, it's like just something interesting rather than a game-changing thing, is that yes, the new camera is now centered, so to speak, horizontally when you have this on the Magic Keyboard. But to come back to this picture, the camera is not actually centered. So these three dots here, that's the center of the screen. The camera is off-centered just a little bit, which isn't a big deal. It doesn't really make a practical difference in any way, shape, or form. The camera is now where people want it on both the Pro and the Air, but probably has to do with how they centered the charging and the magnetic mechanism. This is not the new iPad Pro, by the way, although stay tuned. So it's actually in the neighborhood of being centered. It's very close, but it's not perfectly centered. We've got an Apple Pencil here. This is the old one. A lot of people are talking about the new iPad Pro being so thin that it's thinner than an Apple Pencil, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. When you get it on the Magic Keyboard, of course, then it's not thicker than that whole setup when it's all folded up, but still really thin. The thing is, I noticed if Apple made this any thinner, the USB-C port on the bottom almost wouldn't fit. So the thinness really is something to behold. It's nice in person, but I'm starting to wonder if we've sort of reached the limit of how thin we can go without losing important features. So Apple reconfigured the camera bump on the back. We lost a lens. I don't think it's a big loss, actually. I think Apple gave us one really good camera for the back there. It's gonna work for what people are using the iPad Pro for at the moment. But a lot of people are saying, what is this here next to the flash? This one right here, I believe is a microphone, but this one here, I believe is an ambient light sensor. So obviously that's something that's gonna be a factor, not just for photography, okay, but also when you're doing that new scanner technique. This has a new scanning technology that gets rid of that annoying shadow that's always caused by your hand holding the device over the paper, So in case you were wondering, I believe that that's what that is. Now, something else I want to say here is that this thing is so thin, especially the 13-inch where they had extra room to spread things out, that the iPad Pro, if you didn't catch this, is actually thinner than the Air. So people are making the joke, what's lighter than Air? Well, the iPad Pro. So Apple is maybe in the midst of needing to rethink the naming logic of its iPad lineup. That said, one interesting comment I saw is that instead of thinking of the Air as lighter, it's really more like light, as in less. Not in terms of weight, but in terms of features. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it. I think that's more or less accurate. The Air is the Pro technology just trickling down later at a cheaper price point for people. Before we get any further, let me just mention I'm celebrating the launch of the new iPads by putting all of my courses 50% off. So Learning to Be Productive is 50% off. Freeform Unleashed, 50% off. All of the courses, 50% off. That's for a limited time. If you want to celebrate, those coupons are down in the description. But let's talk a little bit about this insane OLED display here, okay? It's OLED, it's amazing. I saw it in person and I was wowed. I didn't expect to be so wowed, but I was really, really wowed. We'll talk more about that when I get into my review. But the thing I want to point out here about the refresh rate, everyone knows that it's 120 hertz refresh rate. Nice and speedy, that's great. But the new information is that this display also goes as low as 10 hertz. We were talking about that attention-aware display earlier, where if you look away, it's going to dim, save some power. Sort of the same principle at work here. You don't always need that super fast refresh rate. Sometimes you can save some power by just having 10 hertz. I believe it was 20 hertz before on the lower end. Correct me if I'm wrong down in the comments. One thing I want to point out that's kind of weird is Apple's really touting, the environmental aspect of all their products these days. What they didn't include here is that you don't get any more stickers. The days of getting Apple stickers and having way too many that you never put on anything are over. And apparently that's probably why you're not gonna see that, is because really after a while you just don't have a use case for it. And no one really does that anymore, right? There was a time when putting the Apple sticker on was really signaling to everyone, look what I got. But now we're like way past when that was really a thing. So for those that care, the new iPad Pro is going to be shipping with iPadOS 17.4. So you're going to be able to take advantage of the squeeze functionality on the new Apple Pencil Pro and some other new features. Of course, all the good stuff that's really going to take things to the next level, that's going to be coming soon at WWDC. So I can't wait to see what we're really going to get with iPadOS now. You know, an iPad is two things. It is the hardware, but it's also the software. I see so many comments saying, oh, they just gave us this really fast, crazy hardware and software that can't take advantage of it. You know, tell me you don't use an iPad or you're not the target customer base without telling me. I mean, that's what that's saying. Now, here's an interesting item of note. Apple is shipping the 256 gig version of the Pro models with a 9-core version of the M4, which means you're only going to get 3 performance cores, which also means if you want to get all 4 performance cores, you got to get at least the 1 terabyte. So the price jumps from $12.99 to $18.99 there, which honestly, let's be honest here, that makes sense. A lot of people are not buying this to completely max out. So it's okay that there's a little bit of a range there, a gradient on the iPad Pros. Now, I never know what everyone's picking up on and what they're not. I'm just going to point this out as a matter of interest. Some people are going to be like, oh, I knew that. And I've actually seen people complaining about how uncreative the wallpapers are. I don't get that. These are super creative. You couldn't make it. I couldn't make it. But the product names are actually in the wallpaper. So do you see Pro there? Do you see Air? It's right here, P-R-O. And this is an A-I-R as well. That's really nothing new. Apple likes to throw the names in a creative way. You know, like on the iMac, you'll see this. It's just kind of an Apple thing here lately in recent years. And I like it. It's cool. It's fun. It adds some personality. Now, I think maybe the thing that people are most interested in and excited about is the display here. The OLED, of course, which again, seeing it in person at the event, it was like, wow. It was jaw-dropping. I didn't expect it to be that good, okay? But also the nano texture. I get so much interest and questions about that nano texture, which I just saw. I kind of briefly, put my fingers on it, but I didn't really have time to test it or think too deeply about it. Again, I'll just state it's really less of a pencil thing, like the texture, and more of a making sure that you get the most out of the display in the colors in a professional sense. But something to notice about the nano texture, and you can even see it in Apple's animation here, is that it's not on the bezels. It's only on the actual screen, like where you're gonna see content. So what I'm saying is the black bezel does not have the nano texture coating, while the actual screen does. That's kind of interesting. So when you look at it from the side, I mean, you can kind of notice that. Does it matter in the slightest? No, not at all. Not even in the slightest. I'm guessing the reason that that's the case is that if Apple did put the nano texture around the bezel, then it would be covering up the camera, right? So you don't want that. That would create problems. Regarding this amazing nano texture display though, what it sounds like is that it's gonna be on display at most or almost all of Apple retail stores, but only select stores are gonna actually keep them in stock. So isn't that kind of interesting? I guess that tells you a little bit about how many of these Apple expects to sell. I will say everyone's interested in this, probably just because it seems interesting and it is one of the new features, but maybe not the kind of thing where most people who are buying a Pro are going to upgrade in order to get it. That's what I'm thinking. I mean, if you want this matte screen option here, then you have to add at least $100, right, to get that 1 terabyte option. One little detail that's just kind of fun is that the new Apple Pencil Pros have 5 different collector's boxes. But the boxes are cool. I know a lot of people are like collecting sneakers, right? Special edition stuff. For the Apple crowd, this is one of those things that might be worth some money, an unopened box. Let's talk a little bit about the M4. The first benchmarks have supposedly leaked, and they seem to line up pretty good with what Apple told us about this chip, namely that the single core score was 3767, multi-core 14677, which if you compare that to the M3 is like 22% faster for that single core and about 25% faster for the multi. And just so I don't botch this, I'm gonna read my note here, but the M4 is faster than the 11-core M3 Pro in the 14-inch MacBook Pro. Whoa! Here's a really interesting detail. Again, this is the old Pro, okay? We have this camera bump on the back. If Apple had kept the thickness of this previous generation Pro, then they basically could have gotten rid of the camera bump altogether. That's an interesting tidbit. You look at the ad that Apple recently apologized for the iPad Pro. We won't get into that right now. And a lot of people were saying, everything gets crushed down and you end up with the iPad Pro there, but it's not sitting flat because it has the camera bump. So I would like to know from you, does the camera bump bother you, especially if you're using the Apple Pencil just on the flat surface? Not really, let me know. Do you just throw a case on and it doesn't matter at all anyways? Just kind of something interesting. Apple's really touting the thinness here, but if they had kept it as thick as the previous generation, no camera bump. Would you have preferred that? In terms of the wireless and connectivity, here's something interesting. We're limited to sub 6G speeds here. And there's also no millimeter wave 5G either. For most people, this isn't gonna make any difference. It's just something to point out. That is what this video is all about. Millimeter 5G was available in the last 2 generations of Pro iPads, but only in the US, not anywhere else. But now it's gone. Not sure if you caught this, but on the final event slide, it said shot on iPhone, edited on a Mac and an iPad. While the event was going, part of me wondered if Apple had rigged up some iPads and stuck in a new camera, and they were gonna say at the end, like they did for a recent Apple event, that everything was shot and edited on the iPad Pro, because they started shooting all their events on iPhones with crazy rigs, of course, not just like straight out of the box. But still, that didn't happen, but it was edited, at least partially, on the iPad. And that's an interesting detail because Apple is using their own stuff. They eat their own dog food, so to speak. Again, another interesting detail is that we have no more physical SIM slots on the iPad Pro. Apple ditched that on the Pro and the Air. Those are gone. And on the software side of things, Snazzy Q pointed out that there's still no robust clipboard history like you get on the Mac. And that's apparently something that really bothers him. I'm just throwing that in here because it's not something I've ever thought like, oh, I really need that or my workflow is sunk. But I guess for certain people, like there are some areas of improvement and people use things so differently that it's probably hard for Apple to get every little thing incorporated into, the update as quickly as you'd like. Although I would actually argue that Apple does eventually bring the things that really do matter that people are clamoring for to the iPad at some point, eventually. We haven't talked a whole lot about the Magic Keyboard here. One thing we'll say is that it is lighter than the previous one. That's good. There were many videos where I mentioned how heavy the Magic Keyboard was, and especially if you're toting it around with you, it'd be nice to lose a little weight. It's not so much lighter that you're gonna be like, oh, it feels like a feather now. But Apple could have probably made it physically lighter. I think they could have done that in terms of materials and stuff. It needs to have some heft. It needs to have some weight because of the balance that it needs to strike. It can't be tipping over. You put your iPad on there, and the keyboard is the anchor. It weights it down so that it doesn't tip over, especially if you're gonna be poking at it. Something worth just pointing out is that we have the iPad Pro that still, once again, doesn't have Xcode. Apple's brought their Final Cut Pro product and their Logic Pro product to the iPad in meaningful ways, redesigned for touch. And yet we still don't have on the coding side the equivalent, which would be Xcode. We talked a little bit about the camera moving to the right place for people on the front of the iPad so that it's horizontal now when it's on the Magic Keyboard, which is great. But the thing I'm thinking, this is a detail that you probably didn't think about, maybe, is that this probably brings us one step closer to getting Face ID on the Mac side of things, which I think would be great. Touch ID is nice, it's convenient, but if you have a certain setup like I've got over here where the Touch ID button is off to the side, then it's not as convenient as just being able to scan your face, right? So I would like to see that, and I think we're a little bit closer now. Don't forget to check out the courses, and I will catch you in the next video. Later.